fairly packed program and people have very tight schedules. So let me just begin with some very brief introductory remarks, because I don't think I need to explain to this audience the challenge around the financing constraint for all countries, but particularly for developing countries when it comes to making the investments in mitigation and adaptation to meet climate goals. I should say I'm the director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies in UNCTAD. We have organized this panel jointly with colleagues from the UNDP, and I'd like to thank them for the work that they've all put in for putting this panel together. You might ask why an organization on trade and development is putting together a panel on climate. I don't want to go into the history of UNCTAD, but we have been in the finance and development game since 1964. And just to give you one example, the reason why developing countries have access to special drawing rights is because of the work that UNCTAD did in the late 1960s to make sure that special drawing rights were a universal tool and not accessible to a select group of countries. So UNCTAD's been in this question of looking at the relationship between finance and development for a long time. And of course, developing countries have suffered from challenges with respect to financing investment that predates, of course, the climate challenge. Access to affordable, reliable, and patient capital has been a long-standing challenge for many developing countries. And clearly the climate challenge is augmenting the challenges that developing countries face, and the need to find urgent solutions to breaking the financing constraint is, I think, one of the keys to unlocking a successful transition to a low-carbon future for many developing countries. And I very much hope that will be part of the discussion today. It's encouraging from our point of view that much of the innovative discussions over the course of the last 18 months have come from developing countries. The Bridgetown Initiative, the Nairobi Summit, the Sustainable Debt Coalition that was launched by Egypt at the last COP, the loss and damage initiatives. These all have their roots in developing countries' efforts to find solutions to this long-standing and binding financial constraint. So that's one part of the discussion that we had today. Of course, transitions and the investment in climate-related challenges is very much a local effort. And so both in mitigation and adaptation, country experiences and country differences do matter. And we wanted to bring in some of the local challenges and solutions that developing countries have sought to meet the climate and their development goals. And so we hope to marry that discussion of the wider challenges around the international financial architecture with the more local solutions that developing countries are seeking as they look to meet their climate and development goals. So that's the broad context for this panel. We have a number of speakers. I'm going to invite the first two speakers up to the panel, because both of them I know have binding time constraints as well. And so if I could ask Sigrid Kaag, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands and the Minister of Finance for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to come up to the panel, alongside Mahmoud Mohiuddin, who has a very long CV, and I'm not going to go through it. So Mahmoud was the climate champion for COP27 and is a special envoy on financing the 2030 sustainable development agenda for the United Nations. So if you could both come up and join us on the panel to give you some of your opening remarks to this presentation. And I think it's not a keynote, as I explained to the minister. It's really to get your sense of where we stand. I mean, you are a finance minister. You attend the spring and the fall meetings at the IMF on a regular basis, at the G20. You have a strong voice at the G20 as the Dutch finance minister. So where do you see the situation in terms of the need to mobilize financial resources to meet these big investment challenges?
Well, I think one point, I co-chair with Indonesia the Coalition of Ministers for Finance for Climate Action, and I think that's in a way the platform, but also the starting point actually to truly mobilize and to mainstream all actions that are required to actually attract capital, be it public investments or private sector, leveraging the private sector. I see the glass as half full. I think COP27 in Egypt was a remarkable exercise. I'm not saying this because Mahmoud is Egyptian, because he's an international civil servant, but at the same time it was remarkable, and I think also the UAE presidency in the announcement of the Loss and Damage Fund has taken a bold step, in the recognition politically and symbolically of the need for loss and damage, a recognition that the emitters need to pay, and need to pay significantly more than those affected, and there needs to be access to those who need it the most. So this whole debate, I think, is healthy. The cup half full, of course, means we know where we stand, we know how much needs to be done. Half full is also the recognition by the private sector and ministers of finance to start with that they need to shoulder a system-wide responsibility. Because the entire talk on ODA, concessional financing, to my mind, is important. It's nice, but the need to have is system changes. And that means at a national level, budgeting, prioritizing for climate action, mitigation, adaptation, but also the fiscal space that needs to be given. It varies if you're a developing country, obviously, this is euphemistically put, to a developed country. Concessional financing there needs to be upped, and I'll come to that in a minute, upped by, of course, the international community, but at the same time, national ownership, ambitious NDCs that are implementable and scalable are the starting point. And it needs to be in everyone's budget. This is not an ODA discussion. This is not a traditional game. At the same time, we need a framework. We need clarity on the taxonomy. It's not good enough that only the EU has a taxonomy to attract investments or to sort of scorecard, but we need that to assist all ministers of finance to make choices, but also really attract the private sector. If we want to move from billions to trillions, we need to look at callable capital. We need to look at a new way of providing risks and guarantees to risks. And then, of course, have banks, the insurance sector, and other players, such as pension funds, really move in a quick way. But they need clarity, we understand. They want to have their margins be set. And this is where I think the interface public-private sector is essential. Otherwise, we will not move from billions to trillions. And I used to be a minister for aid, and I think it's a crucial responsibility, ministers for international cooperation or aid, but we all know that financing, the scale that's required, needs the private sector. So Sri Mulyani and I are really looking at all these aspects, system change, transformation, provide for the push that the private sector needs. Now, regulation is everything. In the Netherlands, not because this is a prime-time example, but in the Netherlands we are working at legislation to also provide the predictability and the level playing field that the private sector wants. They want to know what the competition's up to. At the same time, we want to avoid greenwashing. We know that there's a plethora of initiatives, there's a plethora of standards and reporting criteria, and that, I think, needs to be mainstreamed. The cup half full is, even though COP28 is not a pledging conference, we need to see the money be moved fast. We need to see a change, and we need to start reporting against this real time. One example, and then I'll stop. ILX, it's an example that's grown out of actually an initiative which I could support when I was Minister for Aid, because sometimes also ODA is very useful for that, whereby a credit fund, ILX, was established, and it raised billions from Dutch pension funds, and it collaborated with MDB financing. So I think the space, private sector, multilateral development banks, and governments is one where we could do much more, and it actually leverages additional financing. Last but not least, because I wouldn't be an effective shareholder if I don't say so, and I'm again not looking at Mahmoud because he's not with the multilateral development banks at the moment, the reform is essential.
Yep.
I mean, we all joined, I would say, the Macron-Mottley initiative, Bridgetown initiative. Reforms are critical. Additional ODA is essential. But the system, multilateral development banks, they're not commercial banks. They need to take risks. I put taxpayers' money there for a purpose, and it is for a global common good. I'm not a retailer. I don't need to make a profit. I want to see my profit in global public outcomes, which are against the SDGs and which are tackling climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Let me turn to Mahmoud, because one of the issues that you've highlighted in all your work is the cost of capital that many developing countries face, which squeezes them in the short term. Many of them are heavily indebted countries, and the rise of interest rates recently has clearly made life difficult for many developing countries, but it also has a negative effect on longer-term investments when your cost of capital can be 15% plus, as it is in many developing countries. So that short-term, long-term connection is one that is a persistent challenge, Mahmoud. Where are we on that discussion?
Very good. And it's always to act fast in the short term with long-term impact. And we have seen the success of some examples when there is a time framework with group responsible for delivery within limited time, and we saw the success of the loss and damage. So it's always hard to come after the Honourable Minister. But I can agree and disagree with you. First, on the glass, half full. Well, as a pragmatist coming from a village in Egypt, I'm happy that there is a glass to start with, and then we can fill it together in the right direction. The glass is the loss and damage, and I can really just summarize that was missing. Now we have it. Seeds money there. World Bank president said yesterday that he will have 90 days for that fund to be established with an independent governance. And this, I'll read your report. Thank you so much for sharing it. But this particular fund, having it is bad news in itself. Why? Why everybody's celebrating it? Actually, we should have been in a position today, in 2023, going to 24, that we need not to have this fund. We should have been doing better in mitigation, should have been doing better in adaptation, so losses and damages wouldn't really require to have an operation of its own. But this is the reality of our life. The other fund I'd like to mention, the Green Climate Fund, and that had its own celebration, and many thanks to you and many other countries that contributed. Out of the 29 countries of 30. They did well. Replenishment was aimed for 10 billion plus. Now it is around $13 billion. I was sharing that with the Secretary General of the UN. He said, well, these are pledges. I said, well, at my level as a facilitator, my responsibility is to get the pledges, to make sure that these pledges are delivered and not shady ones. This is the responsibility of the SG and the whole system. So, but at least at my level, this is a job done, and we're wrapping it up. The third fund is the one that came from the UE, the host of COP28, 60 billion, emphasizing the role of the private sector, not really waiting for more time until the world is perfect and then they inject money. They are willing to take risk, putting $5 billion as catalyst fund, and that could be a good example. That will not fix the problems of the world because, as we know, the gaps are in the trillions and this is just the billions. And a fourth fund, which is the IMF, not using my capacity there, but basically one of the best examples to the audience in the room, and I encourage you, have been always constructively critical of work, but this one may survive you. This is the RST in partnership with World Bank, IFC, Green Climate Fund, ADB, and many others to support a platform, not just a transaction. It's a platform for Bangladesh for adaptation and mitigation in that order. So macroeconomic stability is being taken seriously, then issues related to long-term impact there, and paving the road for private sector to complement. This is an example, and this is basically reforming by doing. It's not just waiting until a transaction is happening, so this is good news. But what we have now, this is the world, if you are in a developing economy like mine, you are between the IRA and the CBAM. The IRA, great news for the US. If you are an American or investing in America, this is fantastic news. It's good as well to see the two parties agreeing on anything, and that is a good thing. But spillovers, we cannot ignore them. If you are investing in Egypt or even in Europe, because investors would compare risk and return, I have generous subsidy from the US, with low risk, with low cost of capital.
Actually, you get a tax credit, which is immediately accessible.
Exactly. Here, this is the issue. I saw European investors considering US, let alone those who are trying to be attracted to Ghana or to Egypt. So spillovers, this is assuming a kind of a collaborative model that it doesn't exist, that the legislator in one country will say, well, my good news for my home may have negative news for my neighbor, what should I do? Well, you can always say, as my good friends in USAID said, well, you have been critical. I said, no, I praised your work. I wish that we can have the same subsidy. But you say, well, you can be part of the supply chain. You can be part of the investments in technology and R&D, and there are going to be some spillovers on that part. But until that happens, there are some major investors that are considering scaling up or even being there because of this tough competition, including in green hydrogen. CBAM, I see it in different ways. The countries need technical assistance to deal with it. I know that colleagues from ministries of trade and industry are pushing for a clarification from WTO. We know that the WTO will not answer before quite some time because they are evidence-based. No evidence will be there before a couple of years. Countries with partnerships like mine with Europe are saying, well, we are partners, so perhaps exceptions could be considered, but that will not be the solution. The solution could be in decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sectors that are basically the target of CBAM, but we need for that finance, investment, not debt perhaps, technology, R&D, and incentives for transformation. The other thing, you are ahead, especially in the ecosystem of the carbon markets. The EU at large, not just Holland or the Netherlands, were helpful to China. Africa is closer. We can really get some sort of benefit from this taxonomy. And this one of the most controversial areas about integrity, rules and standards. And I was moderating a session yesterday, one of the toughest in terms of the issues related to taxonomy and standards and how to apply them. So IRA, CBAM, carbon markets, and then the final one is debt swaps. This could be an opportunity.
Agreed.
And here we need really to be innovative, not just beyond the traditional swaps that we have seen in few countries, including recently Barbados, for instance. But I see opportunities, including actually in the hard-to-abate sector, that debt swaps could be there as well for help. But we need the scale and the platform, and that would require lots of technical assistance and willingness. And unfortunately, the debt structure today is not like that of the 1990s. The creditors are different, but at least we still have some Paris Club creditors that they could consider that. Until the issues are being fixed when it comes to cost of capital, we need really to be super competitive in our business environment in order to attract the investors. I'm talking we as developing economies, emerging markets, or now being called the global south. So we'll see. We have our eyes on Brazil in two capacities in less than a year. We are having many deliverables by the time we meet in Brazil at the summit. And then, of course, COP30. That will be 2 years of advancement of what is being promised here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let me just a quick follow-up for both, because I know you both have to go, and I'll break protocol here a little bit. I mean, the big discussion in the run-up to the next COP will be on the new collective quantifiable goal. That's going to be a difficult discussion, I think. What are your anticipations in terms of the discussions around NCQG over the coming 12 months? Minister, maybe start with you.
I honestly, I don't know. I haven't spoken to our lead negotiator yet, so I want to get his take first. I honestly don't know. But in terms of generics, yeah, we need to be ambitious. If the political appetite is there, I hope so, because given the space also that we're in and that there are elections all around the globe that may impact our ability to act, I would say rather set an even more ambitious agenda and a quantifiable goal, so whatever happens, the politics doesn't drive the decisions, that all the other shareholders and stakeholders determine that this is overarching whomever is in charge. And that applies also, frankly speaking, to my country. I don't know what type of government we'll be getting, so also in Europe there are elections. European Parliament will also have elections, and the mood is quite conservative. Yep. So the risk of a retrenchment or a reversal of pathways, investments and progress is quite real. Yep. So you can have the best quantifiable goals, but you need to also focus on, you need to focus on the politics around it. policy, that's what we've seen in the past too. The best brains, the science on climate change has been there. Why hasn't there not been sort of a more receptive political audience to say, we'll do this? Political will, straight back, and have the courage to withstand the tide and sometimes organize it in a different manner. But a second point I wanted to make, in reaction also to Mahmoud, I think indeed the whole discussion around carbon markets is a critical one, and I would like to do more work with the colleagues, the Ministers of Finance, to sort of say how can we move this agenda, and of course carbon pricing. Whether we do it in pricing or sort of taxation, the measures can vary. I know the African countries, the African continent is very much in favor of a carbon tax.
Yeah.
The IMF speaks to pricing.
Yes.
Ultimately, we want to change behavior. And whatever you do, if the price is different, companies and countries will choose differently. And I hear you on CBAM. We're not deaf to the concerns of possible protectionist outcomes and indeed a setback, what we hope to achieve in terms of trade agreements, the investments that developing countries need or emerging markets, as well, of course, when it comes to the global outlook of the European Union. I think this is a conversation we need to take forward. CBAM was part of the Green Deal. The other measures that we've taken sort of in reaction or response to the IRA actually are intended, of course, for our own competitiveness, but indeed the do no harm principle, which we apply in humanitarian action, should equally apply when you look at decisions that impact others inadvertently and work counter the climate goals and what we're seeking to achieve. But I think that's the traditional policy issue, that one arm fixes something and the other actually creates a new problem. So consistency and coherence is something that I think will only help us achieve the climate goals.
Very good, and we are not in the full operation yet of the CBAM. We still have 2 years or less for the full operationalization. And it's good that many European leaders, including you, are realizing that. And of course, we can always talk about unintended consequences, but if you are alerted, they are not unintended anymore.
No.
So here, it's basically this issue.
I'm not arguing that they're now unintended.
No,
They're still unintended.
Well, yeah, there are enough negotiators. I'm not going it, but at least you know the position of many countries. But to your point on the new 100 billion, or what I'm going to say, I'll be making many people perhaps unhappy. So I'll be brief, and I hope to make them equally unhappy. First, the 100 billion of today, many lessons. The first lesson is not just about the magnitude, that we know by now it's not really big enough. They may have been big enough when they were announced in 2009, but we know that the needs and the gaps are bigger. My concern is not the new 100 billion that could be multiples of the 100 billion we hope, but basically about the standards and the metric that needs really to be applied. And that's why every report on the 100 billion during the last few years have been always challenged, from saying 80% by the joint committee led then by Canada and Germany, and now OECD did the report for 2022. You get independent think tanks and Oxfam, no, it's no more than 18% to 22%. Who is right? If I'm a recipient of these nicely written reports, people are confused because the standard and the metric and the taxonomy is not really clear to everybody. So I think we need really to work hard toward that. Then the 100 billion, yes, as a developing country, how much gaps we have? $2.4 trillion, 100 billion today, multiply that by 9, given the historical responsibility of emissions. Okay, thank you so much. We can shake hands on that now. But we are not the decision makers, we are negotiators, and we are friends or remain friends. But talking about this issue, I think it needs really to have the likes of the report that came up from Vera Songwin-Extern, the report that came from the G20 led by Professor Singh and Summers, the many reports by UNCTAD on gaps. But perhaps we need to do something completely different, because all of these global figures of trillions are close to being guesstimates than estimates, because they do not really go up from the, you said local and national, they are not really bottom-up approaches. They are based on the estimates of the OECD when we're doing the billions to trillions and $2.4 trillion of gap in 2015. Now the gap is 5.4, of which climate action is 2.4, of which 1.4 trillion is being required for developing economies to mobilize at home, while they are many of them under debt service constraints. Many of them do not have high growth enough to generate that. Of course, the minister and I can argue that there are lots of budget issues that we can talk about in terms of prioritization, in terms of the subsidies to the hydrocarbon sector. But until that happens, we'll be reaching 2030 and beyond. So let's be practical and be ambitious. And then we need really to do a better job, not just in the delivery of the pledges, but the pledges themselves, not to be based on a better standard than what we have today. Thank you.
Mahmoud, thank you very much. I'm not going to comment on that, Mahmoud. You know that the UNCTAD position is that we can't do the transition under austerity. For developing countries, the tightness of the fiscal space is already a real binding one. So that's a real challenge. The macro-financial side is a real challenge when it comes to this transition. So let me thank you. But it's a great start in terms of raising the kinds of issues that need to be discussed. So let me thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I have to run. Otherwise, I'll be fired by my assistant. Thank you.
Okay, so can we move on to the second part and invite the other speakers to the London, and I think someone who's probably very well known to all of you in this audience. We have Ms. Tanya Romualdo, who is the permanent representative of Cape Verde to the United Nations in New York. Do we have Casey Flynn from UNDP, who is the Global Director of Climate Change at the UNDP. Do we have the lady from Indonesia? She's not here. So we have slightly more time for you three to speak on the issues. And I'll start with Mariana, because you wrote a great piece, an opinion piece in the Financial Times, slightly critical of the loss and damage narrative, a little bit, saying that there are other big challenges that we can't ignore, which is in a way what Mahmoud said, that loss and damage becomes less of an issue if we've done the investments in mitigation and adaptation to ensure that countries are in a much safer position than would be the case if we go past the various targets that we've set ourselves. So maybe you could speak to that, the way in which you look at the financing challenge, Mariana,
Sure.
From the work you've done.
Great. This works? Yes. Hello, everyone. So if you're thinking of a hole to fill, you will, by definition, first of all, be a bit depressed because it's a hole. You know, it's not very happy. It's about fixing market failure, so always looking at what's not working, as opposed to doing what? Restructuring the financial system to actually be outcomes-oriented, instead of fixing market failures, actively shaping and co-creating markets in order for them to lead to a certain direction of growth, because growth has both a rate and a direction. So we want economies that are inclusive, that are sustainable, that are innovation-driven, innovation to solve big global problems. And if we actually did that, the form of finance we'd have would be very different. We would also have very different public-private partnerships. If you speak to a biologist, they tend to be much more rigorous than economists when they talk about things like ecosystems. The first thing they'll say is partnership, ecosystem. What kind of ecosystem? Is it parasitic? Is it symbiotic? Is it mutualistic? And how do you know? What are the metrics? And so having outcomes-oriented finance is very different from looking at all the different financial gaps that we have, whether it's the 7 trillion, we just heard all these trillions, right? 7 trillion SDG financial gap, 4 trillion for climate. I was on the water panel yesterday because I'm a co-chair of the Global Commission on Economics of Water. So for the WASH SDG 6, we have over 100 billion a year of a gap. So what does it mean to change that kind of gap thinking towards what I've been calling mission-oriented thinking? We would have never, ever gone to the moon and back in a short amount of time with this policy speak of one side de-risking the other, for example, fixing a market failure. They had to embrace the underlying uncertainty. They needed to have outcomes-oriented procurement. Procurement, by the way, I'm a complete nerd about that. It's often 30% of government budgets, whether it's a small island state like Barbados or a large country like China, actually having outcomes-oriented procurement, which we learned how to do during COVID for the vaccines and personal protection equipment. Why do we only do it during wars or when millions of people are dying during a health pandemic? We can normalize that. We can normalize, healthy, sustainable, tasty school meals for every child in every public school in the world. That doesn't just happen by having school meals. It happens by having outcomes orientation to a school meal program. So any form of finance, whether it's a grant, whether it's a loan, so the public banks, huge public banks globally in terms of the numbers. We have over 22 trillion in national development banks, much more than we have in the multilateral development banks. I wrote a piece for UNDP about this, and I presented it at the IMF World Bank meeting in Marrakesh. If you took that, 24 trillion combined in these different types of public banks, and instead of just, am I allowed to swear a bit? My old professor at SPRU used to say pissing in the wind, which was like spread a bit of money here and then, that comes back in your face. Nothing, sorry, it's a technical term. We can add it to our yeah. Actually having outcomes orientation, what does that mean? We have the SDGs, we've signed up to them, right, since 2015. Turn them into moonshots, every single one of them, which need to be interpreted locally, regionally, nationally. That can't be cut and pasted. Places are different. Use those missions and moonshots to help the MDBs work differently with the national development banks. But then the critical bit to get an SDG multiplier is to create, I'm not going to use the word conditionality because that brings back trauma of the kind of IMF conditionality. Let's use reciprocity. So the NDBs, national development banks, can start providing conditions, reciprocity conditions with the private sector in countries, because it's not true that the private sector invests a lot and innovates a lot. It's often, sometimes does, but in more cases than not, like in Italy, where I live. I'm allowed to criticize Italy, Germans are not allowed to, right? We have a lot of inertia. Fiat is one of the most inertial companies in Italy. Only when it went to the US to buy Chrysler and Obama put a condition that Fiat to buy Chrysler had to invest in hybrid technology, did Fiat become an innovative company. The KfW, the German public bank, put as a condition to the steel sector that in order to receive a big public loan, they had to reduce the material content of production in steel. They did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology. They weren't told how to. That would be micromanaging that kills innovation. But they weren't just given a loan to stay alive. Conditional on innovation. That's why we have green steel in Germany. It's not because they went to the WEF, Davos, to talk about purpose. They had to get a penny. The CHIPS Act, which I helped to inform in the United States, Gina Raimondo, she didn't just give out $400 billion to semiconductor companies. It was conditional on them reinvesting profits, not using share buybacks, which in the last 10 years we've had 7 trillion, 12 zeros, in share buybacks. The same number, by the way, it's nice and useful as the SDG financing gap. So this is money extracted out of the economy. The CHIPS Act says that those companies benefiting from a public program have to reinvest funds, pay workers a living wage, improve working conditions, and use green supply chains. We should normalize that. And this is even more relevant, of course, in developing countries. My friend in Brazil, who used to run BNDES, Luciano Coutinho, used to say Brazil is capitalism without capitalists, basically reflecting the inertia that we often have. And it's not about dismissing or criticizing the private sector. It's just about actually debunking this idea that one side creates value, is entrepreneurial, and the other side just needs to regulate, administer, fix markets. Using finance, outcomes-oriented finance, embed within it a new social contract, let's use the nice word reciprocity, to actually guide investment towards the SDGs, put the SDGs and climate at the center of the economy instead of the periphery, at the center, for example, of industrial strategies. So instead of just giving money out to sectors, we think how those different sectors can work together towards net zero goals, or reducing the digital divide, or health-related, well-being-related goals. So these kind of three ideas of having outcomes-oriented finance, going from financing gaps towards outcomes orientation, focusing on the quality of the finance through mission-oriented policies and putting that finance for the SDGs at the center and not at the periphery. And third, doing so with a new social contract, social compact, call it what you will. It's what trade unions know how to do well, right? Bargain, negotiate. At the center of any program, whether it's procurement, grants, and loans, this is what can really actually catalyze, definitely at the national level, that SDG multiplier, but then working alongside MDBs and other multilateral programs gives a bit more walking the talk instead of just talking the talk, as the teenagers keep telling us we're doing, to that trillions and trillions and trillions, right? It needs to land on the structures of everyday capitalism. Charity, philanthropy, which unfortunately I think are often very present at meetings like this, let's see how much money is left over, okay, once tax is paid, right? Once workers are paid the living wage, and once we actually get investment in the real economy. If there's money left over, fine, let's do philanthropy. But if the business model on the ground is an extractive one that's not paying workers well, that is extracting, so not paying tax, which many of the global companies that then set up foundations and philanthropies present, by the way, at this COP do, so on and so forth, that's not changing the system. So for transformation, let's do business differently, let's do government differently, away from fixing markets to shaping markets, and that will give these trillions some concrete, practical meaning. Thank you.
Before turning to, I'll just add a quick follow-up before turning to the ambassador, because I mean you brought in the limits of the de-risking state is very different from your mission-oriented state. I think, Marianne, what are the challenges in terms of building state capacity for what you've talked about that we need to think about?
So that's actually the bit I spend 90% of my time on. I set up a whole institute at University College London about state capacity, retraining basically the civil service away from new public management, public choice theory, which not only thinks about market failures, but then even says, oh, even government failure is even worse than market failure. So know your place, don't crowd out the private sector. Versus what? If you're shaping markets, first of all, that means the civil service are value co-creators, right? They're not just redistributing, regulating, de-risking, enabling, all these words that make you fall asleep, the private sector. It means that we need to embrace uncertainty. When Kennedy said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy to get to the moon, that should be true for all the SDGs. Yet what are the words we use in every policy paper? Facilitating, you know, in Italian, I'm Italian, facile, means easy. Making something easier for someone else, de-risking someone else, that's a recipe for getting, second bad word, screwed, right? So if one side is risk-taking, the other side is de-risking the risk-taker, first of all, where do you think the talent's gonna go, right? If you're a young, bright student, do you wanna be a risk-taker or a de-risker of the cool value creators? So in terms of, you know, bringing in talent, you don't just have to do the Singaporean thing of paying $1 million to ministers. You need to make it cool to work in government. But what does that then mean? The culture of experimentation. I'm a great believer in GovLabs, right? Like outcomes-oriented procurement, which I mentioned, is actually kind of hard. You need to know how to do it. You need to experiment. But why do we embrace experimentation, venture capital community, and as soon as a civil servant makes a mistake, front page of the Daily Mail or whatever your version of those papers are, right? So there's so many different changes. And our curriculum, for example, focuses on value, collective value creation, purpose-oriented policies, creative bureaucracies. There's no reason that the word bureaucratic should be a bad word. When you roll your eyes, oh, it's so bureaucratic. No, it's a bad bureaucracy. It's an inertial, unagile bureaucracy. The reason that NASA changed its bureaucracy after the Apollo 1 program was that one of the astronauts who died when they were blown up, the three of them in that lunar module, said, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because they couldn't hear what was being said in mission control room. So these departmental silos, ministerial silos, not knowing how to work together. Health is not just for the health department. Climate is not just for the Department of Energy. You need interdepartmental working. That requires training. So it's impossible to solve the SDGs, which are all cross-departmental government and cross-sectoral in the business sector, if you're working in a siloed way. But we haven't had that kind of shaking up of government bureaucracy. We just, again, roll our eyes and talk about Kafka when we see departmental silos.
Great, thank you, Marianne. Let me turn to Ambassador Romualdo, because, of course, the challenge that SIDS and Cape Verde, of course, is a small island economy, I mean, amplified in terms of meeting the kinds of challenges that we're talking about. What is the experience of Cape Verde, including the things that you have done that you think other people should be hearing about, not just the challenges that you made, but which you should talk about as well, but also what you've done.
So Cape Verde is currently emerging from a particularly dire situation of debt distress. Just after the worst phase of COVID pandemic, Cape Verde's debt to GDP ratio was 160%. It was among the highest around the world. And this macroeconomic situation severely constrained, of course, our fiscal policy and restricted the availability of public financing to address, among others, the climate crisis. from both the mitigation and adaptation angles. Indeed, while our SDG-aligned strategic plan for sustainable development, we call it PATS 2 in Portuguese, launched this year, calls for the mobilization of 5 billion euros in public and private investment until 2027. Our 2021 NDC update also required an additional 2 billion euro until 2030. As SITs, we face a very serious problem of scale, and this affects also our macroeconomic system, including state budget. To put this into perspective, even if we allocated the entire state budget to sustainable development and climate action, it would not be sufficient to meet the necessary financing targets of our national strategic plan and our NDC. So fortunately, already during the COVID pandemic and throughout the current poly-crisis context, we have been putting policies and strategies and corresponding action in place to generate innovative financing solutions from bottom up. From 2020 onwards, oops, this scrolled down too much. Our Ambition 2030 strategic vision exercise, supported by the UN and UNDP, identified blue and green economies as key pillars of economic transition and financial diversification towards autonomous sustainable development aligned with our climate commitments. To achieve this, sustainable finance and human capital also emerged as indispensable instruments to finance and implement these mid to long-term SDG and NDC objectives. And through this process, two Cape Verde signature solutions arose. The first, Cape Verde Blue X Sustainable Finance Platform, which the Cape Verde Stock Exchange developed together with UNDP through our integrated national financing framework process. The process of this exchange-driven approach is to create a decentralized platform conducive to the convergence of supply of global, regional, and domestic impact investment with the demand for such financing from public and private entities seeking to develop sustainable and climate-aligned projects. So, in less than 2 years of operation, this platform already supported the issuance and listing of 6 thematic bonds of internationally recognized blue, green, social, and sustainable varieties, with a total investment now exceeding 40 million USD. The bonds are subjected to alignment with both international standards as well as domestic taxonomies and regulations, as encapsulated in the Blue Bond Regulation published by our Capital Markets Regulation Authority just over a year ago. So these investments are now turned into sustainable and climate cognizant actions through a diverse range of public and private actors, from municipalities and microcredit agencies to shipping companies, public entities, just to name a few. For instance, our first sustainability bond listing, an issuance from a consortium of private companies supported by a public state guarantee, was designed to provide the financing necessary to invest in the greening of industrial buildings as a means of reducing carbon emissions and pollutions. I do underline that our carbon emissions are minimal. The second solutions, and this I will also briefly mention in the context of our debt sustainability strategy, arose in the form of bilateral debt swaps with Portugal. Herein, we have been able to successfully negotiate the transformation of 140 million euro in debt held by the Portuguese Treasury into a climate and environment fund. Among other priorities, this fund will provide essential seed capital to invest in our comprehensive renewable energy transition strategy with a long-term development strategy that foresees net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The agreement was signed earlier this year, and just a few days ago, the addendum was signed by both prime ministers of our countries during a side event at this very COP. So building on this successful model for climate-oriented debt reduction with requisite support from multilateral organizations, we should now seize the opportunity and seek to negotiate similar debt for nature swaps with other creditors who may be interested in investing in credible climate action to meet their own financial commitments under the Paris Agreement. Just in case any are represented in this room, we will be more than happy to follow up on this right after this session or during the following days here in Dubai at the COP. So Cape Verde has proven itself, again, as a reliable partner in implementing climate objectives and is moving forward swiftly with its ambitious climate goals. These include rapid scale-up in the renewable energy sector and, of course, as a big ocean state, after all, our geographic composition is more than 99 oceanic. Yes, you heard that very well. 99, more than 99. So we are ocean, we are blue, and therefore it is only natural that developing a vibrant blue economy sector is an absolute priority. With adequate technical and financial support from our partners, we envision the reduction of maritime sector emissions through non-fossil fuel bunkering services, as well as greening of shipping and other transportation services that will position Cape Verde strategically and geographically as an attractive blue hub in the mid-Atlantic. This strategy will necessarily involve a range of corresponding and complementary financing services with potential for generating new value, including environmental, social, and economic returns on investment. Fortuitously, these next steps in the BlueX platform's development involve internationalization and regionalization. Most recently, the first blue bond listed on our exchange was also listed on the Luxembourg Green Exchange, the world's leading platform for green bonds, while an MOU is also in place with Angola to jointly develop our sustainable financing services. Constructing on this emerging platform established in the Mid-Atlantic area, we are now further building on Cape Verde's excellent governance record, advantageous institutional capacities, and competitive human capital to provide similar services across Africa and CITES, especially for countries in the south that may not yet have such a portal to access impact investment. In brief, Cape Verde's blue finance strategy means business for climate action. So we are open for business in that field and looking forward to work with new and diversified partners and investors. Cape Verde's government is confident that we can achieve the goals set for our country and our population, but we cannot do this alone. So we count on you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I mean, you've given us lots of examples of the efforts of a small country to think innovatively in the face of the challenges that link to both the climate and the development pressures you face. But you've also said that you have a huge debt burden that you have to manage at the same time. UNCTAD, of course, has long championed alternatives to deal with the burden of debt in developing countries, and UNDP also has pointed out to the real challenges that excessive debt burdens have in the past posed for developing countries, and in many respects have intensified as a consequence of COVID and the tightening of monetary policy in the advanced economies in response to inflationary pressures. So maybe I'll turn to Casey Flynn now and get your sense from the UN, because you have, unlike UNCTAD, you have a lot of people on the ground. We have the privilege of sitting in Geneva and pontificating on these issues. But you have a lot of people on the ground where these pressures are. You on a daily basis, you face these pressures. Where does UNDP see the kind of interface between the global macro-financial and the domestic investment challenges?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Pull it closer. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I really want to start by this remarkable thing, Ambassador, that you said about if you spent the entire state budget, it would not fulfill your strategic plan or your NDC. That is a remarkable statement. And you are not alone in that. We see this quite often around the world. And certainly, UNDP, we work with 170 countries and territories. We've supported 85% of developing country NDCs. And we've seen an interesting evolution of this. And one of the key trends has been we have seen immense ambition. NDCs have been very much pinned on ambition. And we've seen immense ambition by LDCs and big ocean states. We have seen them rise to the occasion in terms of mitigation, adaptation, nature, really looking at how they can abide by these goals that we've set out for ourselves on the Paris Agreement. And the world is failing them in that ambition because the rules are not set up to succeed. And this is where I think what you're saying about this indebtedness, and I think particularly right now when we're looking at the levels of indebtedness around COVID, around all of the conflicts in the world, money it never did flow to everybody that needed it, and we're certainly seeing that exacerbated around the world. And so you have some countries that have done everything the world has asked them to do with the Paris Agreement. You have seen them rise to the challenge, and they do not have the means to be able to fulfill those plans. And when we think about that, and we're on the cusp of this next version of NDCs, right? We have to, at 2025, countries are meant to put forward their next NDC. And along with this thinking of how countries can be more nationally determined in their ambition, they can contribute these sovereign plans, we also have to have, and I appreciate so much of what you were saying, we have to have this rethink about how the system works. Because these nationally determined plans aren't going to work unless we change the system. Because finance is not flowing to everyone that needs it and to everyone that is really doing what the world has asked them to do. And I think that this idea of how we make financing for NDCs feasible, how we help countries that have set out these ambitious goals, how we do it, how we get creative, how we start to rethink all of these assumptions that we have had about the global economy and how money needs to flow, it needs to happen now. And I'm really encouraged about some of the conversations around around this COP, and certainly UNCTAD has been thinking a lot about this. The institute that you have set up, the experiences of Cape Verde. This is where we need all hands on deck for this. And at UNDP, we're really trying to think about how this can come together. And we're seeing, this idea that NDCs can be a roadmap. There is a unique opportunity here that because NDCs, we've had over 140 heads of state and world leaders come to this discussion. They all know what an NDC is. the political backing of NDCs, and this is unprecedented, and we have to use this opportunity to be able to really ignite these conversations about how these NDCs can succeed. And being able to have that political buy-in at the national level, at the global level, can unlock, you know, the discussions on some of these hard conversations. I also think, too, learning from, and this, you know, the example that you gave, the innovations that are happening on the ground. What are countries doing when they are faced with these serious headwinds and the climate crisis is on your doorstep? You know, being able to have, there's no time to waste, and we don't have the luxury of waiting. And so, what are countries doing? And to be able to really help even some of the big economies, I think, have a lot to learn from some of the small economies, have a lot to learn from some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, because they're the ones really trying to push some of these innovative approaches, changing the way tax policy works, changing the way they're looking at, you know, even with the contributions with carbon tax and carbon pricing and all of these things that need to be pushed, the debt for climate swaps, debt for nature swaps. You know, how do we start to leverage all of this? How do we start to use these experiences to be able to help push that needle forward? And we've been very fortunate, because with UNDP we have been able to be sort of arm in arm with countries, being, you know, ready to take this leadership role. We have seen in Gabon a real sort of push from extractives to a green and sustainable economy, looking at things like green taxation, tax expenditure, how you're attracting private sector investment, carbon markets, other areas. In Maldives, looking at how a financing strategy can be realistic about what it means to have a green transition in the Maldives, what it looks like in a big ocean state, what it looks like in a tourism-dependent economy. How can you start to make those choices? And I think as we think about this, being able to really recognize that when we start to change the rules, we can unlock immense possibility. Because when you look at just even the statistics, and you look at even things just from a business decision, you know, $1 invested in renewable energy is 3 times more jobs in renewable energy than it is in fossil fuels. When you look at the adaptation needs around the world, it's $80 to $100 billion. Yet the cost of climate impacts just in urban areas for flooding is $1 trillion. I mean, the case is clear, but the reason that countries and communities are not able to invest is because the rules are not on their side. And so I really encourage us, as we're on the cusp of this, that we can really start to think about NDCs in a new financial era, that we have this immense opportunity. This is the ratchet mechanism of the Paris Agreement. This is how we are going to get collectively to net zero by mid-century. But the rules have to change, and we all have to be a part of that conversation. And in particular, I think taking the leadership of many countries that are on the forefront of this in the developing world, including Cape Verde. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Casey. We've got time, like 15, 20 minutes for questions from the floor. I think you can all stay, I hope, for answering some of those. So let me take questions. Please introduce yourselves when you ask the question, and be relatively brief. Hopefully we can have an interactive discussion around these critical issues when it comes to meeting the climate and development goals.
My name is Chioma. I am the Dex Officer for NDC in Nigeria. I'm very super excited because we need to chart the way forward for the ambitious NDC that the global community has actually asked every nation to do. The first one, this is the second submission, and with the help of the climate promise of the UNDP and also the NDC partnership, most countries has benefited to also create an enabling environment for taking actions when it comes to what we have integrated in the various NDCs. The era of creating an enabling environment is over. This is the time for concrete implementation. We have identified mitigation options of the NDC, which is outweighing the adaptation, irrespective of the fact that we're still a developing nation. Now is the way forward to chart on what are the roles of financial bodies internationally to support capital projects for under the NDC. It's good. The last speaker who said something about institutional changes and also greening of national budget is well understood. But the beauty of the NDC is that it's two sectors, the conditional and the unconditional. We own the unconditional, and we are doing everything in country to make sure that the budget is greening, and we are doing our own bit in the unconditional. But how do we go and scale up this mitigation and reduce emission in a wider? My NDC is very ambitious. We said 47% emission reduction with the support on technology, with the support on finance, capacity building, and every other thing. So how do we assess funding? How do we set aside specific funding to fund ambitious NDCs, basically from the developing communities? Thank you.
Thank you. More questions?
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the tremendously good presentations. My name is Luis Andrade. I'm from the Brazilian delegation. My question is, what is in that change of the systems? What is the role of regulation, particularly for financial regulators, central bank, and other types of regulation? Thank you very much.
I'll take one more and then go to the panel. I think that you had your hand up. The lady in the front.
Hi, thank you. My name is Marianne Groh. I'm a sustainable finance reporter for Euromoney. And my question is about how do we get investment banks to stick to some of the targets that they had previously been setting in order to maintain this 1.5-degree pathway. We're increasingly seeing these investment banks sort of take a step back away from UN-led initiatives like the Science Based Targets Initiative, claiming that these interim targets do not align with sustainable development goals, that in order to make sure this is a just transition, they need to stay invested in coal sectors for longer. So when we talk about these systemic changes, how can we ensure that they also hold the private investment banking system to account on some of these targets?
Right, that's an important question about the regulation issue, and the UN, one of the announcements of the COP was to create a task force on regulating non-state actors, which was an initiative of the Secretary General that was launched a couple of days ago. So this whole question, I mean, there's a lot of talk about voluntary, of course. At least from the UNCTAD perspective, there are limits to the voluntary approach. It's not that it's not an important part of the story, but there are serious limits. That puts onus on regulation and regulators and policymakers to where do we stand? I think that's a very important discussion that we need to have. Maybe, Casey, you might want to start with that.
Yeah, really good question in terms of this high-level expert group that has been, it was launched by the Secretary General and has been talking a lot about private sector accountability when it comes to their net zero targets, because I think it's been in the air, right? That there can be a big splashy event and an announcement of a target, and then a few months later, a few years later, everybody's saying, well, where's the result? And I think these conversations about, and I think this goes to what my fellow panelists has been saying, and that previously Mahmoud and Sigrid were talking about in terms of being able to have these metrics, these standards, these rules that everyone is playing by, and that we can have some collective accountability for companies, and all those that are making these big statements, that we know how these targets can be measured, we know how these targets can be analyzed, we know how these targets can compare to each other, that there's a level of transparency on this that helps move that needle forward.
Marianne,
I was really curious by this figure that you had that you have in your report, which is excellent, by the way, taking responsibility. So figure 10, where you look at all the different ways that funding might appear through different types of also regulations, right? Because tax is a regulation, and you have the probability. Where is it? The feasibility, and you put low on almost everything. Well, actually, only one has high. But so the global financial transaction tax, it's not rocket science. It could actually just a 0.1%, 0.1, not 1, 0.1% global financial transaction tax would raise up to $420 billion a year, just from the US and Europe, let alone companies globally. Why do we think that's hard? Like, when we don't care about things, we see the complexity about it. Again, look at what we managed to do with COVID. You know, Italy, again, we're slow in everything. COVID comes, we quickly adapted. In 3 months, we went from being 100% reliant on Chinese PPE to having 137 small companies in Italy produce all of PPE, because we changed the rules. We changed, again, that outcomes orientation that I talked about. Tax, in most countries, we are taxing labor more than we tax materials. If you want a green economy, tax materials. That example I gave of reducing the material content of steel production, it was done in Germany. It wasn't hard. Why? Because they put a condition. It was a type of regulation. Any sort of contract, in some ways, is regulation. A patent, by the way, intellectual property rights are contracts. I hate the word right. It sounds like it's come from heaven or God. It's a 17-year monopoly profit that the private sector gets from the public sector. We fail constantly in governing patents. We failed with COVID. AstraZeneca, by the way, was forced to accept knowledge sharing with Oxford University because it's a state school. I love reminding people Oxford and Cambridge are state schools. It's not like Harvard and so on, where they're basically hedge funds with some education on the side. Anyway, so yes. So they negotiated that in order to collaborate, so the symbiotic, as I mentioned before, symbiotic public-private partnership was done with conditions. That was about knowledge sharing. Why? In a global pandemic, you want to make sure everyone can produce the vaccine. We shouldn't have to rely on expired vaccines being sent from the global north to the global south. So these issues of negotiating contracts, that's also about regulation. It means, how do you govern knowledge, right? So we know how to do it. We choose not to do it. So I think when we look at the feasibility of doing good regulation, we should always think, when we think it's not feasible, it's probably because of some sort of narrative, story, pushback that's being provided, sometimes by the private sector, sometimes by the public sector. With Barbados, by the way, which we always call it a large ocean state. I love you said that also about Cape Verde. The Prime Minister, we're working with her on a blue economy industrial strategy, and part of that was actually having a new contract with the hotel chains, new regulation with the hotel chains, in order to make Barbados the most sustainable, clean island in the world. Second to you. It needed a new contract with the hotel chains. They refused. They refused, right? So is that, like, should it just be up to, you know, goodwill, or should there be laws in order to even receive any sort of water right, for example, if we're talking about water companies, in order to receive any sort of subsidy, in order to receive any sort of patent, which is a contract, there are certain rules of the game that you should have to, mandatory, right, sign up to. And so I think we need to change the mindset of regulation to new contracts. That's why I talked about a new social compact on everything. Grants, subsidies, COVID bailouts. We gave 600 million in the UK to EasyJet, no conditions attached. In France, they gave the support during COVID to the airlines because they weren't flying. So Air France and Renault, it was conditional on them committing on paper, there was a contract to reducing carbon emissions in 5 years. They had to. That example I gave of Fiat. Fiat in Italy is parasitic. In the US, they were a good company. Why? They had to, as part of the Chrysler deal. So we need to change our thinking. Forget regulation, contracts, negotiation. Learn from the trade unionists. They know how to do it. Look at what UAW just achieved in the US.
Okay, thank you. Just in response to the question from Nigeria, Barbados has come up. The Barbados Initiative 2.0 is still alive and kicking, I think. Where do we stand, though, with the Barbados Initiative? Because it was
the Bridgetown Initiative.
Sorry, the Bridgetown
Yeah.
Initiative. From Barbados, because it's in terms of meeting the ambitious NDCs that Nigeria talked about, it's the kind of initiative that is needed at the globe. So, and I don't know if any, I mean, Mariana, you were involved with that,
Yeah.
I know. So maybe if we could just discuss that, because it is an important initiative coming from the developing world.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's three different dimensions to that. One is what was already said about debt, and the Prime Minister of Barbados talks about the double jeopardy all the time. She says, as you rightly said, the countries that are bearing the consequences of climate change are not the ones that produce climate change. Second, so the double jeopardy is they're bearing the consequences of climate change that they didn't produce, and they're then paying the debt of a very problematic financial system where most developing countries are spending something like twice as much on debt repayments than on health or social assistance. So reframing the debt problem is part of that, getting more aid funding, but especially the loss and damage, which there has been progress on that. The SDRs, so specific tools, there's a bit of progress on that. Voice is a big thing, so who's at the table? And the Bretton Woods Agreement that was set up many, many years ago are kind of the old boys club, so new voices at the table to even form this new international financial architecture. So the co-creation bit, which is about do we even value the countries that we're trying to help. It's a very condescending system which talks about aid, but then the voices of those countries that are, again, bearing the consequences of a dysfunctional capitalist system, their voices aren't at the table. So I think there's some progress being had on different bits of that. It's not necessarily holistic. I don't think the co-creation bit actually has been happening in terms of there's flies everywhere, of those voices, but I think it has power if it's seen and embedded with this kind of new economic design, right? So again, as soon as we start thinking of these massive financial gaps, and those gaps are especially large in developing countries with problems that they did not create, as soon as we move away from financing gaps to restructuring the global financial system, to restructuring the economy, all the programs we talk about under the SDGs, as I said before, are not actually usually at the center of the Ministry of Finance and the Treasuries and the Ministries of the Economy. They're somewhere in the Department of Health, Department of the Environment. As soon as we say, either get rid of the Treasury, which is not very easy, or put those programs within, so we create the finance, we create the taxation system, those examples I was giving before, to deliver on goals. That means we take seriously those problems. So I think the biggest change we need is take seriously, treat as urgent problems that are about social and economic problems as we treat wars. How is it that money is created out of thin air for war? And we're living through a huge geopolitical crisis right now. In Germany, they were saying there was no money. All of a sudden, the Ukraine gets invaded by Russia. Something like 180 billion gets created literally overnight. Yeah? Where was that money when we were talking about education or better working conditions and so on? So treating as urgent, yeah, and I don't like the metaphor of war, but if we have to talk about it as urgent as a war, these societal problems, and structure the financial system, both the global one, so again, the MDBs and so on, the national one, the NDBs, but also the global policies and the national policies, and then we'll see change. As soon as we start even just treating the welfare state, which is crumbling in most countries, and austerity is back and it's decimating our welfare state, as important as the innovation state, right? We all like to talk about venture capital and entrepreneurship and startups, and we all feel very happy when we talk about that. And as soon as we talk about social problems, like, oh yeah, the poor and schools and inequality, right? Just the tone is different. It's two different rooms. Treat the welfare state and the social problems as much as we treat the innovation side of things. Put those problems at the center of the financial system, of industrial strategy and innovation strategy, and I think that's 80% of the battle.
Casey, have you, I don't know, on the Bridgetown initiative, whether UNDP has further thoughts on that?
Yes, and I think this is where these conversations, and I think when Prime Minister Mottley first started talking about this idea that we have to change the rules of the game, and this idea that even if every single dollar of ODA went toward climate. I mean, and I think I heard the other day that ODA for everything in the world, everything is $200 billion. That is, it's a drop in the bucket for what the need is on climate, let alone all of the ways that climate is exacerbating many of the other crises around the world. And so I think that also this is where we see too, I think there's an opportunity here also with the loss and damage fund, is that if we can have the loss and damage fund start to help us think differently and start to, I mean, and you know, and everybody was, and I really commend, you know, we are, what, around 700 million now for the loss and damage fund, and it's a drop in the bucket from what the needs are. And we can't be funding loss and damage at the expense of mitigation, adaptation, because we, in many ways, and I you know, I was reminded of this by UNDP's lead on loss and damage, that, you know, for as much as we've been celebrating this 700 million, it is a moment of heartbreak, because it means that we failed, because we're at a point now where loss and damage is such a reality, and devastation of communities and economies, lives lost, communities lost. This is a reality now, and I think being able to face that reality head on and to be able to say, okay, now what do we have to do? And this loss and damage fund being an opportunity for finance sectors, climate, you know, all of these different ways, you know, what you were talking about in terms of, you know, climate being, you know, embedded across many different sectors, many different ministries. How do we start to use this conversation on loss and damage to think differently? It is a new fund. It represents incredible victory by big ocean states, LDCs, frontline communities who have fought for this for years, and we need to get this right, and that means facing those hard conversations.
Okay, well, I'll because of conscious of the time, let me just add a couple more questions maybe, and then I'll wrap up very quickly. One in front here and behind. Do we have a microphone?
Hello, my name is Dimitri Bokuma. I'm a member of the delegation from Equatorial Guinea, and I work for UNDP country office there. So my question is for the ambassador from Cape Verde, and I would like to know what would the key ingredients, like the 3 major items that contributed to the debt for nature swap between Portugal and Cape Verde. Thank you.
And can you get in front of you? Okay, behind you, losing control of the mic.
Good morning. My name is Amanda Saramaga. I'm the UNDP resident representative from Mauritius and Seychelles. And I've liked very much the conversation about restructuring and reframing the finance architecture. And I wanted to ask a point or hear the views around the fact that even Cabo Verde, that is sitting next to you, or Mauritius and Seychelles, given that they are upper middle income or middle income, high income, will probably not gain access to the loss and damage fund. And so that the conversation about developing countries and those who are making attempts at mitigation and adaptation is well and good, but then at the same time, when solutions are found, there is this sector of countries that are doing everything they can, particularly the 38 SIDS of the world, who happen to also be UMIC and HIC countries generally, and they still won't benefit even from the little that's in the loss and damage fund. What are the views on this?
Would you quickly, if you can, please?
I'm Carlo Battori from the Italian Foreign Ministry, Development Cooperation Department, and pretty much fascinated by the approach taken by the panelists. And my quick question is, talking about climate financing gap, there is a staggering figure, which is the absence of pension funds and sovereign funds from Africa, for example, and focusing more on Africa, to support interventions in adaptation and mitigation in their own countries. So what can we do? And we were discussing about the manager of the Italian Climate Fund. They would be really great to work together with those, institutions to support interventions in various countries in Africa. So what can be done in order to, let's say, encourage those funds to work for Africa instead of investing money elsewhere? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think there was a direct question for you, Ambassador, so if you could answer that, and I'll go back to the panel.
Starting with the very direct question from Equatorial Guinea. the three main ingredients for the debt swap with Portugal. First of all, there was this debt among both countries, and Cape Verde proposed, and Portugal, after of course negotiations, accepted it. Instead of paying back this debt to the creditor. This amount is transformed in investment in areas to combat climate change. So instead of paying back the debt is converted in investment by Portugal. So it works on both ways, because on one hand, for us, it releases funds to invest where they are urgently needed. It will create jobs. It will be invested, of course, applying green options. And for Portugal, it allows them to also contribute. And of course, if it's investment, there will be returns from this investment. I must say, well, I don't need to say it because it's obvious. I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm not from the financial sector, but it's more or less that way that it works. The colleague from Seychelles mentioned about the problem of access to loss and damage, but also other funds. Yes, as I mentioned during my intervention in the beginning, SITs, not only SITs, but of course I speak for SITs, they do have a big problem, which is scale. So one solution might be the countries coming together as one bloc, for example, AOSIS. Then it's not just one tiny Cape Verde and a tiny Barbados and so on, but it's this big group applying as a group and then among themselves dealing with how to allocate which amounts to whom and for what specific purpose. So on AOSIS, we are now working, we are approaching SITS 4 next year in May. This year we had the 3 regional meetings, SITS regional meetings, ICE, Caribbean and Pacific. We had the interregional meeting hosted by Cabo Verde, that was end August, beginning September. And this was like the last very big meeting at that level before we head to Antigua and Barbuda next year. So this will also be one of our big topics on the SITS conference, because SITS, it will be, of course, about survival. It will be about 1.5. It will be about access to financing for adaptation, for mitigation, for tackling climate change. And the last, I don't think the last one was for me. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to pick that one
maybe
up,
just quickly,
Mariana? We'll just quickly go down because
on the middle income
time.
country, I think it's exactly this kind of condescension point, right? Which is, instead of understanding that there's some structural deficiencies in how we have actually organized production, which has led to the climate change globally, how we have organized finance, this idea that oh, we'll just give it to the poorest, right? And somehow that'll make us feel good. That's a consequence of having this old mentality that, again, the Bridgetown Initiative through the co-creation voice side is trying to change. So that would be an immediate thing to change, which is that all countries that have been disproportionately hurt, whether they're low income, middle income, maybe even some high income countries, would be helped to actually face the consequences instead of making it increase the debt burden even more. But by the way, something that no one's talking about is we're about to have a financial crisis, right? So the ratio of private debt, everyone obsesses about public debt, that's why we get austerity. The ratio of private debt to disposable income in many countries, including the UK, are back at record levels. That's what caused the financial crisis. It's not like the Financial Times doesn't talk about it. Elections don't talk about it. And the consequences are then borne globally. Doesn't matter where it begins. And in terms of the pensions, really good question. It's actually extraordinary that there's been little progress on that. The whole Mark Carney, initiative, and one of the many COPs ago. And I've always thought, I mean, this isn't the only answer, but it's extraordinary that pensions are, you know, funds of the people, right? If you look at, say, for example, BNDES, the Brazilian bank, gets most of its funds out of the workers' kind of pensions. And so that alliance that there should be, whether it's the Canadian teachers' pension, the workers' pensions that are in these pensions funds, may be what needs to change, because, you know, we have these COPs and then nothing changes, is to see that alliance between these different issues. I talked about the welfare state. You know, teachers and public school systems are not benefiting currently, whether it's in high-income countries. I can tell you teachers in the UK are on strike, our nurses are on strike, our doctors are on strike. We have a crumbling global welfare system, and yet the pensions of public service workers are locked up in these funds that are not then being directed at improving, you know, the state of affairs on all sorts of different levels, you know, whether it's, again, low income, middle income, or high income. And there's something, I think, to be done in forums like this that move us away from just thinking of, again, development, climate, and bring it back to the structures of everyday capitalism through things like the welfare state, which, you know, Beveridge in the UK, I think we just celebrated the 55th or something anniversary of the NHS, for example. Those conversations are always separate from the conversations about finance and development. And maybe pension funds are a perfect place to bring these conversations together and say it's a crime that the money of workers in even the public service, because a lot of these pension funds, again, look at the Canadian one, which is one of the largest, it's public service workers' pensions in these funds, are not actually being directed at doing good. And how we define good, whether it's geographic, whether it's, you know, SDG, I mean, that's sort of a second level question. But the first level is that they are not currently part of the solution, they're part of the problem. And in the UK, by the way, 80% of our finance goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. FIRE. It's a nice acronym. Not only is the planet on fire, finance is on fire. So even just redirecting finance into the real economy and the good bits of the real economy, and in globally Africa, and not being stuck in kind of the, you know, global north, these are all really relevant questions.
They love to talk about fiduciary responsibility.
Yeah.
Marianne,
Yes.
of course. Kathy, last word with you.
Yeah, very, very quickly. This question about the categorization of countries is so important because, and I think this way that the world has been categorized is outdated. It is not fit for purpose. And not only is it putting us in the right direction, it has the risk, actually, I think, of undermining collective climate action. Because there is no excuse for a country that is as vulnerable as one hurricane can wipe out half of their GDP. One hurricane can wipe out immense level of infrastructure that you have to go into immense levels of debt to build back, only to have a hurricane come back a year later and do the same thing. The idea that you don't have access to support just doesn't make sense. It is, and I think it is an irresponsibility that we have reached now on that. And so I think really being able to think about this in a much more multidimensional way. How do we start thinking about the nuances of economies that are out there? I mean, and how do we start thinking, because, you know, even in this process, I mean, I still remember back in the day when it was Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, right? And that's sort of largely shaped some of the conversations here, many of the conversations here. And now we have to be much more nuanced in the types of challenges that countries are facing, and particularly on the climate crisis. Those that are on the front lines, this has to be included in the calculation for this. Certainly on this question also, I wanted to respond on Africa as well. I think that there is an immense opportunity in Africa, I think, and an immense moment of leadership for Africa, because when you look at Africa being able to take on bold moves, in particular on renewable energy, on adaptation, on agriculture, I think there's a possibility here that many countries in Africa can sort of go beyond sort of the traditional development trajectory and really have sustainable development, green economy at the core of how the economies are working. And we can see that even the opportunity of, it's 600 billion across the continent don't have access to electricity. The implications of being able to have clean electricity for the populations in Africa, what it means for schools, what it means for hospitals, the development impact of that.
Casey, we got to wrap.
Sorry.
They're about to kick us out, and I don't have time to wrap up. So I'm just going to be shamelessly opportunistic and say that UNCTAD people mentioned the loss and damage report. We will launch on the 8th the report, along with the report on NCQG, on 2.1c, and hopefully on the just transition. So for people that are interested, these reports from UNCTAD will be available. Can we just, though, thank the panelists for a great panel this afternoon. Thank you.